Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Tonight, Darren, I think we're going to get a little bit strange.
We are
maybe
indeed
a little bit highly
strange, in fact.
Highly strange. Exactly. Yes, tonight we are talking about high strangeness, a term that is used frequently in our circles, and maybe not necessarily with a great degree of clarity or consensus. And so we thought it might be good to focus a little attention on exactly what constitutes high strangeness, why it's important, what might be some examples of this within not only ufological circles, but the paranormal. And then I think land on what high strangeness really kind of means for reality and the way in which we look at the world. So why don't we start off with the definition that you provided. I'll read it for everyone. So we're going to define high strangeness as a quality of being peculiar, bizarre, utterly absurd. And I love that. It's got this ramping up quality to it, and does point definitely towards the oddity of it all. So what does it mean to you, Darren, when you think about high strangeness and that definition in particular, and the importance of this to our topic of interest?
The first thing that occurs to me when I even listen to that definition that we came across is that it's qualitative in nature, right? And so much of our modern Western civilization is about quantity rather than quality. And qualitative experience has kind of been relegated to subjective, mushy stuff that doesn't really count and doesn't really matter. That's one of the reasons I think why historically the high strangeness that is so central to this phenomenon has been discarded or suppressed or underrepresented in terms of data that we need to really wrestle with, in terms of what you just said, in terms of what it means for reality itself, right? These can't be one-off experiences. If this experience of bizarreness and absurdity even is happening, it's saying something deeply significant about the nature of reality. At least I'm convinced that's the case. I think most people that have really done their research recognize that too. I remember Peter Levenda in his interview with our friend James Iandoli on Engaging the Phenomenon said, high strangeness is a feature, not a bug with this phenomenon. It's central, in other words. And to ignore it is to miss the point of the endeavor. It's as central as the consciousness component in many ways, I think. So I think about all those things. But I think for people like you and I, the way we're wired, we always go to the deepest level possible. So we start thinking, what does this mean for reality? That's the most interesting question for me when I think about this.
Mm-hmm. And I've always been fascinated by the works of Jacques Vallée, for example, who wasn't really afraid at looking at all of the data elements of the experience. And he didn't seem to be quick to discard as well. This doesn't seem related at all to flying saucers or what have you. So we're just not going to include the strange dreams or other events that may have occurred around this sighting. But it does seem like we are entering into a time in which high strangeness is kind of becoming in vogue, at least to start looking at that, right? I can remember as a younger person thinking about UFOs and really only thinking about it in a very one-dimensional way, through the lens of Hollywood or the Roswell incident, never even remotely considering that there were other strange qualities of the experience that went along with those stories, just being oblivious to them. And that's in part because the narratives themselves didn't include them. So it seems as if we now are at a place where we're willing to re-examine all of the facets of the experience and try to come away with some learnings. But how do you think about the concept of high strangeness in the history of the topic? Where do you see it emerging, and its role within these sort of big events in history?
Right. When you pointed out Valet, I think he's been a central character in terms of legitimizing the high strangeness and demanding that we look at it as another data set. Um, because he, as I've said many times before, because his approach was to actually be a kind of boots on the ground investigator. He would, fly across the world if he needed to meet with experiencers, ideally before they had come into contact with a bunch of ufologists who perhaps had biased or prejudiced or limited their story or tried to, steer their story. Valet went in and tried to have a really objective take on what they were experiencing. And once he established that they were credible people who were professionals, who had family lives and reputations like all of us, and he recognized that they were not doing this for fame or fortune or notoriety, he began to recognize there's something really weird happening to people around UFOs, and in some ways, he got to a point where the UFOs were kind of secondary to the primary experience of the cosmic connection. So he's been central for legitimizing it, as has John Keel, and even people like J. Allen Hynek, to his credit, came around to seeing that as well. Because, I'll refresh people's memory that going back into 20th century ufology, when you're doing your darndest as a researcher to try and have your field of inquiry taken seriously by the mainstream, the last thing you need is a bunch of weird stuff that sounds like hauntings or paranormal stuff, coming into the mix. It's going to just make it much less likely that you'll be taken seriously in the mainstream. And you often see this as kind of a nuts and bolts technology of extraterrestrial beings who've flown here from Alpha Centauri or whatever. And so you often get to the point where you actively suppress it or refuse cases that have too much high strangeness, or if you are forced to deal with some, you'll just downplay that. And because, as I pointed out in my recent talk in New York, because there's no sort of peer review of how data is analyzed and presented and collated, people just kind of willy-nilly pick the parts they want to talk about and exclude the rest. So for a long time, I think this was underrepresented in the material historically. And again, it's to his credit, people like Valet and Keel that really brought it to our attention, to the point where now we see the paranormal and hauntology, that's Haunt, haunting, in other words, hauntology, and ufology all being part of a meta category. Actually, I think that's the way we think about it now, or the way we need to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Right. The degree to which we often self-audit our experience as well comes to mind. How often have we heard examples where someone will recount their story, their experience, and leave out some really big components of it, only to later, when it feels more comfortable, and that might be in the setting of a therapist's office or with a group of other experiencers, they'll open up and say, well, and this other thing happened that I haven't told anyone, and I don't really know what to do with it. I had this crazy dream, or I had this poltergeist activity in the house, or oftentimes it can also be something sexual in nature, which is something we absolutely are used to suppressing in our culture. So you have all these elements that are in that mix and in the soup, but we really just want something. We're just pulling out the vegetables because we can easily identify them. We can't see all the things that are in the broth, So it's a fundamentally important part of the experience. To separate them out, I think, is doing it a great disservice. It's also one of the most challenging things to account for in our attempt to understand what it is, right? Because many times the high strange qualities of the experience are so subjective and contextual that it's difficult for us to go, okay, well, these were all a craft of the same kind of shape, and there, we so easily can categorize a spaceship, quote unquote, rather than some sort of paranormal type of experience or dream state or what have you. How do you think about the kind of just the challenge of incorporating high strangeness into the narrative and into an ability to understand what this actually is?
Well, I think I would actually turn that question on its head in some ways and say that I think the people who really have become diehard researchers and have really grappled honestly with this material actually end up deciding that unless a narrative experience includes some absurdity or high strangeness, they're not sure it's actually a real account. In other words,
Mm,
it's so central to these experiences that if there's not an element of weirdness, bizarreness, absurdity, there are people like I think even Anne Strieber, Whitley Strieber's late wife, would talk about that. You know, when people would write them in with letters, if there wasn't a little bit of that, like what, element to it, she wasn't sure whether to take the account seriously.
mm,
Bernardo Kastrup's talked about that as well. He wrote a really great book called Meaning in Absurdity, and he talks about the very same thing. If the story is too like sci-fi, aliens came down, landed, took me back to their planet Sugaba, and I met some strange, green-headed aliens, and then came back and they flew away and gave me, mince cakes or something to give to my family. If it's too straight-laced and there's no like impact on consciousness and after effects and residual experiences that are weird,
mm.
it tends to perhaps point to the story not being actually an example of the UFO phenomenon, which again, we mean that broadly to paranormal stuff as well. So it, like I say, like Lavenda said, it's a feature, not a bug.
Mm. Well, before we begin unpacking the sort of sub-qualities of this definition, maybe we can spend a second talking about why it is that we are prone to discard high strangeness generally. And here I'm talking about a favorite sort of whipping post for our show, and that's the paradigm of physicalism and our temptation and tendency to just discard things that we cannot reduce down to these materialistic qualities. And it strikes me that we're throwing the bathwater out and leaving the baby in the bathtub, and saying that the bathwater is not important to this bath. So, how do you think about that interplay in the 20th century and now in the 21st century as we're beginning to see that there may be more to reality than we once thought?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I see people when they enter into this topic, which becomes addictive in many ways, right? We were talking before we went on about how it even creates difficulty in people's relational lives and their families and whatnot, because for people who really get taken in by this topic, it does end up being questions about reality and why we're here and the big questions. And for those who don't take it seriously, it can create some distance and some conflict in those relationships. But I think that what I see people doing is they'll try to hold on to their current paradigm, right? Their current narrating way of seeing reality until there's just so much data that they have no choice but to move a little bit further away from that. And then another step, and then another step, until eventually you determine that our working conventional model of reality with physicalism is just not tenable, And I think about the analogy of when I went from being, an evangelical to not being an evangelical, and now being very spiritual, but not identifying with any particular religious tradition, even though I've been very influenced both by Christianity and by Buddhism, for instance. I remember going through a phase where, first you're solidly, Southern Baptist or something, right? And then you're kind of like, I'm going to flirt with Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, right? And that's cool, but it's still a little bit too like dogmatic. So then I'm going to be like emergent church, right? And now I'm really cutting edge, and there's a lot of postmodernism. But eventually you get to a point where you say to yourself, I think I'm kind of fooling myself. Like I'm really not in this camp anymore. And as scary as it is in these kinds of experiences existentially, right, to step outside those borders and say, I no longer identify as this. I think those are some of the most transformative experiences in our lives. So when that happens, and I think that's what happens with this phenomenon, and people's that are really interested in this and taken with it, is that eventually it gets to the point where they're like, this is more central to what's going on, who I am, why I'm here, what all of this means, than the things I used to be taken with. So that's the trajectory I see people going through. And I think that's one of the reasons, as we've discussed before in this podcast, why the notion of disclosure for so many reasons is challenging. But one of them being that the most of our conventional thinking society is not prepared to say what's on the table here is the very nature of reality. And yet I don't know how you really enter into this discussion without getting there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can see pretty much every day in our circles the kind of posturing that occurs in seeking legitimacy by saying, well, I'm not interested in the woo that I can't explain in a data set. If you're not bringing me data, then it's not real. Discarding the fact that time and time again in the data, through the experience, people having the experience are telling you this is what's happening. Well, I don't have an imprint on the ground. I don't have a photograph. Well, that stuff is happening only in your mind. And these other things are happening in physical reality. And there's that posturing that occurs to try to gain legitimacy with our society at large, and recognizing that these are things we will value. These are things we won't. And where I get frustrated with this, and we talked about this before we went on air tonight, is that I would argue almost everyone has some experience in their life that is grounded in intuition and feeling and something that is inexplicable, and it has a dramatic impact on the trajectory of a person's life. That the kinds of events that we like to be able to point to and say, well, this is real because I can put it into a lab experiment. Those kinds of things make up a small quantity of the events that have profound impact on who we think we are, who we choose to be in the world, how we define our story. So I find it just incredibly disingenuous and frustrating that we go around, clamoring for all of this data, making it sound like it's so relevant and important, at least data of a certain kind, yet discarding just a giant swath of the human experience. And to me, that's one of the benefits, the beauties of this study, is that it redeems those things and gives them a place at that table in the conversation. And as you say, points to that fundamental question. Reality is not as it seems. Okay, what is it really?
Right. And I would add that when people talk about, can you reduce this to something that's reproducible in a lab, for instance, because you brought up, what is data? Number one, as we often say, but it's always worth saying again, that when you have a lot of accounts of very similar experiences with very common themes, and those themes are weird, and people don't want to have to admit those themes, and yet they show up time and time again, that's a good indication that actually there's validity to those claims, that those elements really are there somehow. Now, the question around, is this just in people's heads, becomes kind of an ironic question, because where you and I have landed is that kind of, reality itself is a mentation process, that ultimately mind stuff is behind what we perceive as physicality. So in that extent, everything is in our heads, right? But not our physical heads, but our larger stream of consciousness kind of mentation process of which we are a part. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, I think about, for instance, when depending on which circles I'm in, I will be, more forthcoming or not around contact experiences I've had and information downloads I've had, right? And depending on who's listening and how bizarre I think that will be to them, I decide whether or not to talk about it. But I've had some people say, well, okay, so can you reproduce that in a lab? In other words, like in their mind, that's the only way that would be legitimate, right? And prove that it was really happening. But of course, what that forgets is that you're even claiming to be in contact with another intelligence. That's not something that just like will repeat in a lab, right? If you even try and take a dog or a pet, and bring them into a lab and get them to do something, it can get challenging. Let alone some super sophisticated, non-physical intelligence, right?
Mhm.
John Alexander's talked about places like Skinwalker Ranch and observing what he called precognitive sentient phenomena, which was his way of describing trying to conduct scientific experiments like you would in a lab, right? Saying let's test to see if A is true, and the way we'll try and prove that A is true is we'll set up this experiment, we'll do it, right? If A happens, we know that yay, our hypothesis is confirmed, or if not, we'll plan something else. But then what ends up happening is the very means by which they hope to confirm something gets messed with, like precognitively. In other words, it seems like this intelligence knows what you're going to try to test before you even try to test it, before you've even conceived of how you're going to try and test it.
Hmm.
That shows the level of precognition that these other intelligences have, which makes it seem like ridiculous and, since it's the word of the day, absurd to think
Hmm.
that you can reproduce this in a lab, right? It's just not that kind of phenomena. And again, this comes down to our assumptions about the nature of reality and our assumptions that we're at the top of the food chain and that everything else is inert, dead matter that we can just, manipulate the way we want to in lab situations. And it just doesn't work that way.
Hmm. Well, let's break it down. Let's kind of step through the definition a little bit because I think it is a good way to unpack some of the aspects of high strangeness. So let's start out with the peculiar. And as I've been thinking about this word, I'm going to reference back to my Christian upbringing, which to me didn't seem peculiar at all. I was born into the church, and that's the sort of air in which I breathed for a very long time. But what became peculiar to me when I first started having an awareness of the wider world is that there were other people who went to other churches in the community that I grew up in. So I found that like strange. Why is not everyone going to this one church that I have found to be, the most important place to orient my life around? So that little sort of subtlety, at least in my own experience, was quite strange. And it's funny how that one little thing ends up sort of opening up the crack to some larger issues later on, which we can touch on in a minute. But that's just one example, and I wanted to use that because it is something that maybe some folks can relate to that doesn't have anything to do with kind of a UFO experience or something paranormal, but it speaks to the fact that we're all born into a world not of our choosing. We take a lot of things to be givens in our childhood that we later find out to be aren't givens. They aren't norms. They're just little things that we have been told are the way things are. And it's nice that everyone has that experience. It's a very common denominator. So as we grow, we realize that the world is not as it seemed. It's not as encapsulated in our family unit and our family values as we were taught to, or at least we came to assume. And so that's the way that I think about this, not being a direct experiencer of anything that is what we might call classically strange. But I think it is a good reference point for everyone, at least to think about this from a broader context. So when you think about peculiar, what are some sort of things that come to mind for you and your experience?
Well, when I think about that word, like you say, it's the least offensive, the least of a stretch in terms of generally people have had that experience, right? And when I think about that and the UFO phenomenon, I think that sort of aligns with when you experience elements that don't seem to fit with the narrative you had sort of held about what this is. So it's not yet at the level where it questions, your model of reality. It's not at the level where it makes you go, how does that even make sense? But it is an element of, that's strange. If this is the case, then why that? It's just sort of that, mental that you do kind of thing. Like that's a peculiar. It's an anomaly, right? It's the first level of anomaly. So, for instance, again, if your notion is that these are extraterrestrials flying in spacecraft, then why is it that when you look at the spacecraft from the outside, it seems like 100 times bigger from the inside? That's weird. That's peculiar. If these are physical objects in physical space, and physical space is a real thing, then why the discrepancy in the experience, right? Those kind of things is what I think about. It's that first level of strangeness where it hasn't got really weird yet, but it's enough to make you begin to question your prevailing understanding of what this is.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to a recent interview with Valet where he was recounting similarities in the Trinity event and the Socorro experience, and he brought up the beings in the craft. They had the suits on and everything, but there was no, sort of what we would consider to be a breathing apparatus, or they didn't have any trouble operating within our atmosphere, which is something you would traditionally, at least from our scientific understanding, think they might need if they were from some other planet, some other atmosphere. So it's this familiarity, that humanoid form, but challenging the assumptions that you might bring to the experience.
Yeah, indeed. When we're brought up with this evolutionary model of biology, and we assume that beings are heavily adapted to the environment they were formed in and evolved in, and had multiple generations of, then yeah, we were taught. I remember, even in science fiction, the norm was that the weirder you can get in terms of, this thing looks so bizarre, I didn't even recognize it as life, or and the environment it existed in was so different that it's it's like breathing sulfur, right, or something like that, or it drinks acid for lunch, kind of thing. Yeah. So it's sort of like the shocking sci-fi thing was like, they're so different than us. And then, like you say, what we have is these experiences of these humanoid bipedal beings, sometimes things, beings that look completely human, right? Sometimes there's subtle differences. Other times they look no different than your neighbor, which doesn't fit with our understanding not only of sci-fi, but even, what we were taught about how our shape is completely arbitrarily, or it's dependent on where you're born, but more importantly, where your ancestors were born, and you can't separate your form from the environment in which you live and you exist. So that's something I think about with those elements.
Mm. Well, where would you put synchronicity in the scale here? Would you consider that? I mean, it may depend on the severity of the synchronistic event, but I think of kind of the synchronicities we're all accustomed to, that you learn a new word and then all of a sudden you're seeing it everywhere, and it's not a averagely used, it's not a word that you would normally run across. It's a very strange word. Now you're seeing it pop up all over the place. That strikes me as peculiar. So what do you think about that? What do you put synchronicity here?
That is a tricky one because, number one, as I've come across recently, people have different working understandings of that word. I think traditionally, in conventional mainstream culture, you're taught that it's basically meaningless, right? It's just two events that maybe are connected in your thinking about them. So they hold some level of significance to you, but there's no implication beyond that, basically, right? And then you have the far other end of the spectrum, which is where I ended up, and people like Carl Jung ended up here too, that actually synchronicity is saying something about the underlying nature of reality itself, and that what we experience superficially as synchronicity is actually a residue or a byproduct or a derivative of the actual structure and movement of reality in the subterranean regions that we don't experience directly, but we see the after effects of, the kind of way that you see a flag moving, which tells you that wind is there, right? In the same way, synchronicity is the sign that we see on the superficial level, telling us that something is moving in the subterranean meaning making machinery or organic structure of reality itself. So I think that synchronicity is in some ways people's on ramp to high strangeness. I do hear sometimes people saying, and I sometimes get caught off guard by this because I don't personally have this experience, but I seem to come across a lot of people who say they started paying attention to things and paying attention to synchronicity. And the next thing they knew, they were like so deep down the rabbit hole, they wondered if they'd like fooled themselves and they were like reading into things that weren't really there, right? So you hear that quite often too, that people start believing that the universities or the university, the universe is talking to them through everything, right? Like, you know, you had a particular bowel movement. What does that mean? Right. You know, I dropped my pen. What is that? What's the universe trying to tell me? I personally don't have that difficulty. Like for me, I do experience synchronicity. But to me, it has a qualitative nature to it, right? It's not just about saying this happened, then this happened. And to me, that's synchronistic. It's about the qualitative element of it, that there's this way that it impacts your consciousness that says, aha, there's something here that's like a residue of some deeper movement in reality, which is ultimately consciousness. So yeah, I think that synchronicity is absolutely in this game, right? It's part of the same general topic, and this is often an on ramp for people before they've even experienced maybe strangeness with the UFO phenomenon. Maybe they've never had a sighting or had contact with a being, but they do begin to experience these elements of synchronicity. That often is the first stage in this deep dive down the rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the bizarre, ramping this up just a tad here. So I'll give an anecdote from my experience. So I'm not a frequent dreamer. I'm sure I am dreaming every night, but I don't remember them quite often. And when I was in college, I had what I think was probably, if not my only, but one of maybe a very small number of lucid dreams. I was between terms. I was actually taking some summer classes, and I was separated from my girlfriend at the time. This was early on in my college years, and in this dream, I was transported to the top of the world. That's the best way I can describe it. It's a very strange way that dreams can make you think where you are. But I just knew it was the top of the world. It was like I was almost like I was visiting like Superman's crystal headquarters or whatever, sort of snowy landscape and whatnot. And there was an old man there who either I equated to God or had that kind of godlike wisdom, that sort of stereotypical God figure. Even though I was already at the point where I knew God wasn't, a man or a bearded person in the sky, but in my dream, this is what it felt like. And he said to me, he said, "Well, it's the end of the world. It's the end of the world is finally here." And I was like, okay, interesting. And then I was instantly transported to this beach, this coastal, like I was in Florida somewhere, but I was inside of a multi-storied condo that had been shorn in half. So I'm standing in a condo room, but instead of a window, like the building is cut in half, and I'm looking at the ocean, and I'm looking down the beach, and it's just pure devastation along the beach, like very apocalyptic. Other buildings either utterly destroyed or also shorn in half. Sky was darkened, and then I was transported to the beach itself. When I was on the beach itself, the ocean was no longer there. It had receded, and I really couldn't see where the water was. And what was left was this, barren ocean floor with these gigantic, almost like rusty whale carcass rings that were emerging in the seabed, creating kind of a tunnel into the depths of what once were the ocean. And in the sky, in the dark, cloudy sky, was this gigantic swarm of colored orbs, just circulating and spinning. And at the time, I knew nothing about orbs and the connection with orbs and UFOs, none of that at all. But I felt this compulsion to go down this tunnel. Like I was supposed to go down into this ring structure, into the abyss, basically. As I'm starting to do that, I hear this voice behind me basically saying, don't do that. Don't go. You got to come back. And so I turn around to look behind me, and behind me is my ex-girlfriend at the time. And I'm looking at her, and I'm like, it's like I was like shook out of a stupor, just so like I was in a trance, and I wasn't in a trance anymore. And I saw her, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't go. This is very bad. I need to come back, and I need to be with you. So for me, this was a kind of a pivotal moment in my life, because I had never had a dream like this. I never had a dream as vivid as this was. It's actually a dream that I wrote down in a journal, which I never really did. I'm not a journalist or journaler, and I've lost the journal, which really frustrates me. I'd love to go back and read it. But it was one of those moments where I sort of was listening to my subconscious, and it was saying to me, like, you're supposed to be with this person. And that's something I already knew before this dream really occurred, but it was this affirmation of what I already felt. And that, believe it or not, has like kind of oriented a lot of my life. I mean, we got back together, we got married, we have a family, and I think about it. I probably not a week goes by where I don't think about that dream in some form or another. So, truly weird for me. But a good example, what I talked about earlier, where this very strange thing that isn't what we would point to as like something we can quantify in the way we'd like to quantify our big life decisions, but it absolutely has changed my life and for the better. So anyway, that's a long preamble to this bizarre section, but I think it's a good example of what, at least from my experience, what we're talking about.
Right. And what I hear in that is this sort of next level of strangeness, right? So peculiar is still fairly tame. Bizarre is a much more extreme word, right? Connotatively. And really speaks to the qualitatively different level of experience, right? Is what I hear you saying in that. Mm-hmm. When I think about where I would land a few of my experiences, personally, I don't think too many would really go into the absurd. I definitely want us to touch on that because I think there are some elements there, even where the trickster phenomena comes in, but we'll save that one for when we get there. But when I think about bizarre experiences, one is around my own personal actions, right? So you have interactions with some sort of consciousness, some sort of intelligence that seems non-human, or at least non-conventionally human. And you end up doing things that don't make any sense to you. And I've experienced this personally. This is this is a calling card of the phenomenon, right? That I think for some people is extremely disturbing, actually. That what we're saying is that some other intelligence is able to control your mind, control your actions, control your emotions, right? I recently did a podcast on POC where you would see on a dime that if you're getting too upset, they could just calm you right down, right? You find yourself walking into a spaceship and getting up on a table to be examined, and their hypnotic regressionist says, "Why are you doing that?" And well, because I was told to. And but in real time, you don't even have that conflict of why am I doing this? Because thoughts are just popping into your mind, and we're so used to thoughts being us being the owner of those thoughts, right? The originator of those thoughts, the author of those thoughts. It doesn't even occur to us that other intelligences could interject these decision points in our very mentation process, which is, again, very disturbing for people who have a really clear-cut notion of I'm this, you're that. There's no crossover, right? And what this phenomenon does is say, oh, there's plenty of crossover, and don't be so sure about your definition of who you are. And even when you describe your situation with that lucid dream, I think about that, like we have access to much larger portions of ourselves than we usually interact with and work with. And it's through things like dreams and astral travel and psychedelic journeys that we experience those broader parts of ourselves, right? So before we even get to the notion of these others, there's a much, it's like the proverbial iceberg, right? The part below the water is much more extensive and substantial than what we usually see and interact with. And we can experience that in dreams. But getting back to my point about how behavior is determined by these other intelligences, sometimes human behavior, I had a couple experiences of that where I look back and I go, wow, that's just, I cannot for the life of me determine why I would have done that. It just doesn't make any sense based on my personality, my history, the circumstances, and yet it's exactly what happened. And I think when you've experienced that personally, it's a very different level of just hitting home in terms of how much this really does happen. Because you know yourself, you think you know yourself, right? And you live a certain number of decades and you've always made decisions a certain way, and suddenly you find yourself acting in anomalous ways, right? So for instance, one I'll touch on really quickly. I've talked about it elsewhere. When my wife at the time was pregnant with our son, which is our second child, in a hotel, this humanoid female being appeared in the middle of the night or early morning hours. And I got up and walked towards this being. The being then proceeded to walk through the wall, then came back outside the wall. And what's really strange is, and again, this is the first level of strangeness, is I was like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll go back to sleep now. That seems like the logical thing to do. That's what people do, right? After they see a humanoid entity just appear in their room and walk through a wall, they go back to sleep, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what I did. And again, thankfully, my wife at the time, shook me out of my stupor and said, we need to talk about this. Are you not thinking about what just happened? And it kind of snapped me out of that trance-like state. And we had a conversation and ended up not staying at the hotel for the continental breakfast. We got out of there as fast as we could. And this was before I really had a strong understanding of how that kind of strangeness was associated with this phenomenon. Like I didn't think aliens or UFOs or non-human intelligence. I just didn't know what to make of it really. But if I hadn't been, shaken out of my stupor, I probably would have gone to sleep and just assumed it was a dream, or maybe forgotten about it altogether, right? So I think that happens to a lot of people, by the way. So that was an example where my behavior just didn't make any sense to me, and I don't think it would make sense to anyone, right? I mean, you would think that you'd have adrenaline shooting through your body, you would be, I don't know, screaming or, hightailing out of there as fast as you could.
At least call the front desk. I mean.
Right. Exactly. Room service. Yeah. Well, can you tell about the entity? Yeah. So, and I have one more I'll quickly share too, that happened more recently, just a few years ago, since I've lived here in North Carolina, where there was one time where we were trying to induce contact, but through kind of a shamanic kind of experience. So we had a big mother drum and we're doing kind of shamanic drumming and inviting the presence of benevolent others. And what ended up happening was within about half an hour, this huge sound came over the house. Like it's really hard to describe because it was a deep humming sound. It wasn't like a passing jet that gets, slowly louder and then recedes. It was just a consistent, really loud hum, immense hum over the entire house. But what's weird is we just all walked around, the three of us, right, in the house, kind of ignoring what was going on, not even talking about it amongst ourselves. We didn't talk about it till the next day, right? The next day we're like, it's like almost like when one of us brought it up, all of us kind of like, yeah, let's talk about this, and it brought us back into our consciousness. So that didn't make any sense to me. I didn't go outside to look, right? Because now I think might have been a giant craft above the house, right? But so the logical thing to do is to get out, go outside and take a look, right? I
Mm-hmm.
didn't. I think part of me, when I reflect on it, was afraid. I think there was a part of me that was like, I don't want to have to deal with this right now.
Mm.
I know some part of me knew that I kind of initiated the contact, but I didn't think it would show up like that, right? So
Mm.
I was partly feeling that, but mostly the rest of it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's just bizarre. Like, even though I would feel some fear, I would at least want to talk about it with the people that are with me that are experiencing it. And yet we didn't, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
hear cases like that where I remember in one case I covered on POC where Terry Lovelace and his friend, right, had this experience with this black triangle and being abducted. And when they were driving back, they didn't talk about it. They'd both been abducted, but they did not talk about it the entire journey back. And it wasn't until months later, even when the military was trying to keep them apart, that they kind of said, that really happened, didn't it? And it's like very, very strange behavior. So it was similar to that experience there, where it just, the fact that we didn't talk about it, the fact that I didn't go outside, none of that makes sense to me. It's extremely bizarre, verging on the absurd, right? Um, and yet when it happens to you personally, you have this disjointed experience, right? You have this experience where things rolled out a certain way, but how they rolled out doesn't make any sense based on your understanding of who you are and your usual pattern of behavior.
Mm-hmm. They're like these almost like fulcrum moments, right? Where it's your life kind of just hinges on this intersection, right, where you're confronted with this complete abnormality, and then you have to do something with it or not do something with it. But you can't be the same person you were before that you're going to be after. So it's almost like a chapter starting that you have to wrestle with. I don't know that there's so many times in life that are like that. At least in looking back, maybe sometimes they become a little bit clearer. And it's rare. Maybe this is one of the qualities of the bizarre, that it not only is clear there's a change, but you notice it in that time as well. It's as being very profound. Um, well, what about? I know we talked about difficult to kind of pinpoint some utterly absurd examples, but I don't know if you have any in your own experience, but I'm sure we could point to some in the literature if we thought about it. But what do you think about here when you're thinking about the utterly absurd aspect of high strangeness?
Yeah, interestingly, I think that term obviously is, how we apply it is based on our framework of what is normal, right? So once we've established what's normative, then from there we say, well, if it falls a little bit outside that, it's peculiar. Actually, if it still falls within it, but kind of an outlier, that's peculiar. Bizarre is like it's really sitting on the border. Absurd is, I don't know how to make any sense of this, right? So I think, again, when people try to wrestle with the level of control that some of these others are able to wield, it nears that. At least if you're very wedded to your conception of reality, for instance, it doesn't make any sense to people. It seems absurd to people that they could, for instance, show up above an interstate where two people in a car will see this giant mothership, one person in the car will not, and then pretty much everybody else on the interstate, packed LA traffic, will not see anything, right? How is that possible? Some people will say, well, let's say that physical reality as we understand it is safe. Let's just say that they're beaming into the consciousness of the people directly. I think it goes deeper than that. I really do think that the rendering of reality is the level at which they are operating, and it's not just about interfering with the mentation process of a human being, as if like manipulating the neurons or something, or
Hmm.
the synaptic connections in a brain. It's much deeper than that. But to reflect on my own experience, the one I shared with the huge humming sound, what was interesting about that relates to the story I just said about the interstate kind of scenario is a day or so later, we ran into our neighbors, and the lady brought up the event. She
Hmm.
also heard this huge humming sound, the night before, and asked if we had heard it. And we had. And then, without me saying anything about my interest in this topic, she said, I immediately thought UFO. And I
Hmm.
thought that was so interesting that this neighbor, and I've only talked to her like 2 or 3 times ever, but we ran into her, and she said, yeah, that's my initial thought. But she also didn't want to go look, which doesn't make any sense. And what adds to the strangeness is that her husband didn't hear it, and he was also in the house. So there's an example where it's not the kind of thing based on the level of volume that I was experiencing and that people in my house were experiencing and that this woman experienced that you can
Hmm.
just ignore, right? Even if you had headphones on, you would hear this over top of that. It was that loud, but he
Wow.
didn't hear it. So again, that kind of custom crafting of the experience of reality is really, really bizarre, right? It goes beyond just peculiar. This is now, verging on questioning our model of what reality is, right? Some people would say, I'm questioning my own sanity, but here we have multiple people experiencing the same thing. So, does it make sense? Is it logical to assume that this is a collective delusion? Or, again, when you take this in the totality of all of the historical narrative around this phenomenon, that this is, again, a feature, not a bug, this really does seem to be pointing towards the nature of reality itself. Um, Now, in terms of absurdity, I think one I think about is, or a couple examples I'll give. One is, I remember I think it happened to the kids in Zimbabwe, and I brought this up in New York as well. There have been cases like this where beings will show up, right? So people will say, well, were they dreaming or was it physical? It's like, no, it was physical. They walked, people saw the craft in front of a tree, right? The tree moved. So we have indications this is happening in physical reality. But what's
Hmm.
weird is the kids notice the beings walking across the field, and then like a frame skipping in a movie, they suddenly jumped back and walked again, saw them walking again that exact same stretch of field. So what does that mean, right? What is
Hmm.
that? Is that some sort of residual effect of a space-time distortion that they're able to work at that level, or is it deeper than that even, right? This brings up those kinds of questions. um, there's also times where, again, the absurdity comes down to how does that even make sense. So for instance, I think his name was Joe Simonton, and he had this experience with these beings that landed in his backyard, and they came out and they didn't look like grays, they didn't look like reptilians, they didn't look like mantis beings, they looked like Italians. So again, like perfectly human Italians, right? And so
Hmm.
again, ufologists of the time really didn't want to have anything to do with this case. And in fact, when the military looked into it, the way they explained it away is to say that this guy somehow mixed a waking state with a dream state in the middle of the day without really having any notion of how that actually happened. It just basically was an explanation that chose not to deal with the experience at all, the data at hand. But what's even stranger is that they made pancakes and gave him a couple pancakes to take with him, which he actually was able to produce and gave to the military, and they actually examined it. Right, they actually had technicians examine this at the molecular level and determined, sure enough, they're pretty much standard pancakes, kind of cardboard tasting, but pancakes, right? And so it's that level of like, it's one thing to think about gray aliens coming in sophisticated, shiny spacecraft with really advanced computer banks and things like that, right? Craft that maybe can hover, things that look like next gen to us, right? But the idea of a bunch of Italians stepping out of a craft and offering up pancakes and sometimes asking if you have some water for their journey just doesn't fit with any notion of how that makes any sense, to the point where even ufologists would rather accept the military's decision that this was just basically a waking dream experience. And so it explains it away. And so even the ufologists will say, yeah, I'd rather accept that conclusion than have to bring this data into my reckoning of what's actually going on.
Yeah, I think of some other good examples. Often these come with the snicker factor. So it's the skinwalkers at the Pentagon anecdotes about the dino beaver or the werewolf standing under the tree or retreating into the bushes or whatever.
Smoking a cigarette, no less.
Smoking a cigarette. Yeah, I mean, these things literally are utterly absurd. And I'm laughing. They are hard to take seriously. They're very hard to take seriously, and that makes them ripe for ridicule. And you can see how that those two aspects of that are recounted in the book become these almost Achilles heels of the book itself. Like, it's like, oh, I can't take anything else seriously that's in this because of these incidents that can't possibly be true because they're so absurd. We just have to discount them outright. So I think about that quite a bit, that we're just not really well equipped to wrestle with these elements of high strangeness that we're not accustomed to. And our culture, like the way we talk about our experiences and our stories and what sort of constitute the things that we consider to be normative. I mean, there's just no place for this. Like we don't have any good place for this. It's all fairy tale. It's all Hollywood. It's all, sort of drug induced stupor or something. We write it off. And I wonder too, and we talked about this before, to what degree would cultures of the past, how would they explain these incidents? What kind of importance would they place on these incidents that we laugh at?
Well, I think you kind of nailed it in a really ironic way when you said we think about these and we consider them fairy tales, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's ironic about that is that conventionally, the way we think about that now, the notion of a fairy tale is that it's basically a fun children's story to help them develop their imagination, but it has no basis in reality, right? Like we don't even, like the very way you use that term is the conventional way that term is used, which is to say,
Right.
Made up fun stories that have no basis in reality, right? And yet when you go back and you read some of these case studies, there were actually people with an early but pretty established scientific mindset who would study fairy lore, like a couple hundred years ago. And when you read those cases, they're not describing like kids making up or hearing fun stories. They're actually interviewing people and cataloging data of experiences with strange beings, either non-conventionally human or non-human altogether, right? And again, to Jacques Vallée's credit, he saw that, wait a second, these ancient tales of experiencing beings who are not human, but appear to be around our vicinity and not only interact with us, but sometimes the way we would describe it now is they mess with our notion of space-time. You'll have people who disappear for weeks on end in fairy tales, right? And they show up and their families say, where have you been? And they're like, what do you mean? It's been like 20 minutes. And they're like, no, you've been gone for 2 weeks. And again, years ago, if you and I had heard stories like that, we would laugh and say that that's a fun story. Of course, that can't happen. Now, number two, we know based on more modern notions of space-time that absolutely could happen. You could have a local space-time that's different than relative space-time for other people. And that's again, a feature of the UFO phenomenon. It happens all the time where you have these missing time, things like that, right? Missing time was, again, a feature of fairy tales, right? And by fairy tale, I mean that just literally being stories about encounters with fairies. I don't mean it in a snicker way. I mean in terms of,
Right.
again, ultra-terrestrial beings, you might want to call them, that are having encounters with human beings, sometimes abducting them, sometimes they don't, the human beings never return, sometimes they have sexual relations with these other beings and produce what we would consider now hybrid beings within the UFO phenomenon. I
Hmm.
mean, this goes back so far that we actually now are forced to ask, wait a second, are those tales actually not so made up after all? Are they not so fantastical, but they're actually based in reality somehow? And yeah, they are not really any substantially different than what was recounted in Skinwalkers of the Pentagon, like you said. And you made a great point there that most people or many people won't even bother to reckon with those experiences. They hear Dino Beaver, they hear 6 foot tall, standing on two legs, wolf being smoking a cigarette against a light post, and they go, "Yeah, whole thing's bunk. There's no way that there's any possibility that could be true." Therefore, these people that are reporting any of these events, even more standard UFO kind of events, can't be taken seriously, right? It just de facto that is now excluded from consideration. This is again what this phenomenon does: is it presents these bizarre elements of reality where, whether you call it, I mean, the way that I've described it is interpenetrating fields of mentation, that ultimately reality is a construct that's ultimately kind of a mind derived experience. And in the same way that you have a dream and everything feels physical and real, and if you fall off your bike in a dream, it hurts just like it does in the real world. So it's, again, it's internally consistent. But what we sometimes have is not these hard, rigid lines between different reality constructs, but there are certain times where you have overlap, you have interplay, you have interpenetration, right? And this was, again, a major feature of stories of the UFO phenomenon, even early in the 20th century. This notion that these others would tell human beings there are interpenetrating realities that you're a part of right now. Reality is multidimensional. Even when you detonate atomic bombs, you are doing things interdimensionally that you don't understand yet because you have no notion yet of the complexity of reality. So this is really what we have to reckon with. This is, to me, for me, I have been around this long enough now that this is exciting to me. This is worth exploring, and I don't exclude that kind of data anymore. And I'm kind of come around, like Bernardo Kastrup and Strieber, in terms of, if experiences don't have some element of strangeness, then I'm not sure they're actually an example of this phenomenon.
Hmm. Well, it, to me, presents a challenge. How do we get from where we are now, the models that are most prevalent in our culture, to models that can better incorporate elements of high strangeness and treat them seriously? I think we have a tremendous hurdle there to overcome, because it gets to one of the sort of fundamental aspects of our science, that reproducibility component that we really can't quite get here. Um, and so we're having to really grapple with the highly subjective nature of these experiences, and then drawing meaningful conclusions from them. Um, and I think too, we've come to a place where our thinking is so prescriptive, not at an individual level, but as a societal level. Like we personal truth is not as important as the things that we can learn, that can influence us as a global civilization via things like technology. And so, uh, in some ways, for me, incorporating high strangeness and non-duality into my way of thinking, it kind of pushes me away from this older way of thinking, and really puts the spotlight on the individual experience in a strange way, right? It's a little bit ironic because with non-duality, it's not really about, me and you. It's we're really connected at a fundamental level. But at the same time, I guess what I'm getting at here is that we take very seriously the experiences that we have as individuals, and we place a kind of primacy on them, that we just don't in our current way of thinking. But how does that work, sort of macroscopically? I mean, should it even work that way, right? Should these unique things that happen that are so strange, should they act in such a way, if we were to analyze them and take them all seriously, should they change our society in a uniform way, or have an effect on it? And if so, like what is the effect there? What are the learnings from that?
Well, the first thing I would say, and this relates to my presentation in New York, is that what I did when I got to the point where I was coming across all of these descriptions of really strange encounters was go outside the UFO phenomenon, get away from the literature, look at other fields of inquiry, and see if there was anything else in other fields, other scientific endeavors that would lend support to the validity of these experiences, or even lend some explanation potentially as to what's going on. People often lean on, quantum everything, right? So people who are into everything from New Age to the UFO phenomenon to consciousness studies like to just say everything's quantum, right? Like quantum grocery shopping is fun to do.
Problem solved.
That's right. But what was fascinating to me is that I did indeed find investigations and evidence and substantive data in other fields of inquiry that support the reality of these claims, the reality of these described experiences. Donald Hoffman, we've talked about several times in this podcast, pretty boldly says that we do not experience reality directly. What we experience is more like an interface with icons that only very loosely and non-literally reference a deeper reality structure for which we never interact directly, at least in our waking experience, right? So when you look at it that way, suddenly you say, well, it's not like we're experiencing reality as it is, and then we get this some weird stuff that is interjected. What he's saying is that everything we see around each other and around us is an icon that the process of evolution has used to allow us to interact with that deeper reality. But that deeper reality is so complex, so overwhelming, that if we were to pay attention to all of that data, we would be driven to extinction. And so they've done these simulations with evolutionary game theory where you can run hundreds or thousands of simulations. And what they find is the beings that actually try to take in the account for all of that data were driven to extinction, whereas the ones that developed shortcuts, ways of knowing just enough to stay alive and reproduce, were sure enough able to do that. And therefore, just by an extension of that, people like you and I are the progeny of ancestors who learned those shortcuts. So already we know there's really no question here. It's not like we have a 60%, accurate display of what's actually going on. What Hoffman will say, and again, this is backed up with mathematical theorems, this is not just wishful thinking here, says that the chances that what we see is actual reality is precisely zero. We do not see reality as it is. It exists. There is a deeper structure. We just don't interact with it directly, especially in our waking experience. Again, I think in astral travel, lucid dreams, psychedelic journeys, we can actually, meditation even, we can experience that broader reality. And as I mentioned in my talk in New York, interestingly, these others, when they seem to choose these prime contactees, these people are going to have a lifetime of really profound experience with them, they will often, again, enter the consciousness of these people when they're adolescents and basically prep them to learn meditative practices. So that becomes the protocol, the means of communication with this deeper reality where many of these others usually dwell, right? They can come into our construct the same way that you can send me an email and it can show up in my desktop, right? But that's the level that you need to think about when they come into our physical reality. It's the same way that Nathan sends Darren an email, right? Um, and then even with physics, right? So again, in my talk, I talked about Nima Akani Hamed, who's a physicist at Princeton, and how he has basically shown that space-time is not really there, is the way he would describe it. I think people sometimes get confused by the language when we say things like space-time is doomed. When he says that, when a physicist says that, what they mean is it's not really there, that what we experience is an approximation, a derivative of some deeper process. And the way that we can tell that it's not really there is by the process of measurement. Again, this is where science is so great, because unlike people's wishful thinking, it tells you precisely where you're correct and precisely where you're wrong. And when you try to measure things at the really small scale, like what they're doing with a Large Hadron Collider at CERN, what we find is you have to use so much energy to measure a really, really small space that you end up collapsing that small space into a black hole. And on the other end of the spectrum, when you get to the event horizon of a black hole, this super dense object, space-time as we understand it becomes incoherent beyond the boundary of that black hole, beyond the event horizon. So what physics and science has taught us in the past is when we come across those kinds of boundaries where we can no longer even in principle conceive of an experiment, it's telling us bluntly that that is actually an approximation, a derivative of some deeper structure, that what we're actually measuring at that level is not really there. It's more like again, an approximation, a derivative of some deeper process. So it works within certain boundaries, but ultimately cannot be real, because even in principle, it breaks down at certain points, which tells you actually some deeper structures, what's really present in reality. That's what reality actually is. And already there are signs of evidence of this deeper structure that you can even find out in some of the math. So we might take hundreds of pages of algebra to describe some sort of small event in space-time, right? It takes hundreds of pages of algebraic equations to explain. And yet, if you remember from high school math or college math, when you can reduce your numbers and you can sort of collapse that equation to a much simpler common denominator, that's kind of what they've been able to do. And they've been able to show with something called the amplituhedron, which is a geometric structure, how all of the elements of quantum theory and space-time can be projected out from this notion of an amplituhedron, which is, again, a geometric structure. So in other words, they found this much simpler, more elegant way of describing reality, which would, as a byproduct, produce space-time and quantum theory. So in other words, the interface we live within that Hoffman talks about is a projection of this deeper structure. And we even have evidence now of what that deeper structure might be, even though it's likely not spatial temporal at all. So to me, this is fascinating work. And this is where my focus has really been, the ultimate nature of reality. And my last point is, what's of course fascinating about this is it agrees with so much of ancient esoteric Eastern spirituality around reality being more like a thought, a mentation process, that everything we think about in the phenomenological world is actually an illusion ultimately, and some deeper process is what's really real, and that, as Hoffman would say, consciousness is perhaps the bedrock behind all of it.
Do you think that our fixation on physicalism has been a fool's errand or an unwise sort of path, or do you think that it has value in and of itself, that it adds something to our understanding of the idealistic viewpoint? That was it sort of not necessary for us to chase all of this technology and science, and would we have been better off had we adopted the idealistic worldview instead? Or do you see this more sort of inclusive, that we, in order to kind of appreciate it, we needed to go through this journey first and foremost and incorporate some of the learnings from materialism into our worldview? How do you kind of bring these things together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, as I've pointed out a couple times before, the reason why physicalism has had such sway and has become such a dominant paradigm to the point where it becomes unquestioned, right? The same way that religious dogma was in the past, is because it's been so powerfully transformative for our civilization, right? We've extended our lifetimes considerably. We die of infectious diseases far less than we used to. We now have probes that are, now beyond our solar system. We have robot rovers on Mars. We have cell phones. We have televisions, refrigerators, the internet. All of these modern marvels are produced by physicalism, right? Or at least are produced by the powerful way we've been able to model nature, how it behaves, and by doing that, we've been able to, with predictive power, manipulate the way that nature behaves, right? Because we can predict it, and once we know how it's going to behave, we can use that to change our experience of reality, set in quotes, right? But you've talked about this before in previous conversations. I think you've been on our last episode. And yet, in the midst of all those modern marvels that are, quantitatively and qualitatively impacting of our experience of reality, there's a meaning crisis, right? We have all these great shiny objects, but we think that we're just, meat socks that are nothing more than the byproduct of neuronal connections in the gray matter of our physical brain. And when that deteriorates and dies, there's nothing to us. Which of course begs the question, what's the point of shiny, fun objects if there's no meaning behind it all? And if you think that you're basically a blink of an eye and then you're non-existent and nothing, within a couple of generations, no one will ever know you existed. There's no point to it all. We try in mainstream culture to find ways to talk about meaning in more, location specific, temporally specific ways, because we know in the background that there's nothing ultimately real about our consciousness, things like that. So you really can get to the point where you ask the question, are we better off, and in what ways are we better off, or what have we traded in exchange for these modern marvels? I think that it may be that, at least for our species, it's a necessary step, that we ironically had to go from idealism being kind of the mainstay to then embracing physicalism until we hit the boundaries, and then realized, ironically, after all of that idealism actually is the better notion, and that what we were actually manipulating was a sort of middle state or a derivative state of some deeper reality. Hopefully what will happen is that the two will kind of be married together, and that we can take the best of what physicalism has given us in terms of transforming our physical reality, set in quotes, while also recognizing and re-embracing the enchantment of life and the ultimate meaning of our consciousness and the permanent nature, the eternal nature of who we are, and how that connects with the substrate of consciousness itself.
Well, then this gets to, I guess, the agenda or agendas, perhaps, of these other intelligences that I think we would argue have this type of awareness, may have gone through even a similar conscious development of their own. They may, in fact, be trying to guide us on our journey to maybe avoid some of the same pitfalls that they themselves perhaps made, or give us opportunity to avoid them. We may still avoid them, or we may still make them. So what do you make of that with the different kinds of intelligences that we hear about, and what they're up to, and where we might be going here.
I'm glad you asked that, because I think when you think about these matters in this broader perspective, it does change the equation. So, for instance, if you are wedded to a physicalist model of reality, and you think, therefore, that, listen, human civilization and the planet we exist on is in a rough spot, with climate change, with the fact that we have ever more powerful weapons, and yet not a growth in consciousness that thinks deeply about the impact of those weapons, not only potentially on our existential future, but the biosphere in general. If you think only in those terms, then you could easily say, listen, others, why don't you step in like yesterday, please? Because, we are on the verge of potentially having an extinction level event that's self-performed, basically, right? Mass suicide, basically based on our discrepancy between our level of consciousness and our technological development. That makes some sense if that is your model of reality. But if your model of reality is that this lifetime is just one of many, and that the lessons we learn here are more important than the particular iteration, whether it's this iteration or every other iteration we've been a part of, then suddenly you say, perhaps, and I know this will be shocking to some people, but this is the way I think, and this is even, again, I would say what's been communicated to me with the others that I have been in contact with, is that it would be more important for us to learn the lesson of an extinction level event of an entire species than to be rescued by kind of this nanny state of these others who came in and basically had to take over like an occupying force in order to keep us alive and keep us going. Because what I'm saying is that staying alive is not really the most important thing of all. What matters is the lessons you learn, because we are eternal beings. So even if we get wiped off the face of the planet in this iteration, there will be other iterations. So it's a really important question you ask, because I think that when you think about the nature of reality, when you think about how this may be just one lifetime of many, that we even having experiences as human beings is not our only possibility, that we also have histories and futures where we will be something other than a human being, perhaps a gray alien, something else. Then suddenly it changes the equation. It makes it more acceptable, I think, for people to recognize that they may be trying to facilitate the learning of those important lessons that stretch over many lifetimes, rather than being focused on what's happening in our particular iteration at this time and space. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I do like the sort of evolutionary model of conscious awareness that I think entails. But I also think about the sort of vast scope of life on Earth. So not just our own, human experience, but the experience of the planet, and the smallest organisms to the largest, and how that fits into the overall puzzle. And I know that it does. And so that, as we've talked about before, when looking at the world and reality from the standpoint of it's all consciousness, and that these are expressions of consciousness. These are individuated sort of conscious agents, to use Hoffman's term. That gives me a little bit more peace with the notion that you just described, that we may have to wipe the slate, but the journey itself isn't over. And there has to be and I guess this sort of points to me to be some sort of arc of moral development in a way as well. Like there has to be sort of stakes in the game. There has to be something at stake in order for development to occur. And life in all of its expressions, in its joy and its pain, like it creates those conditions whereby which growth can happen. And so, it's an incredibly elaborate construct in a way. I mean, it's like the richness and vastness of this tapestry of life that we experience is quite incredible, in service of this goal. Knowing that it could be just like an Etch a Sketch, you could shake it up and it would be gone. To do it all over again, like that's pretty incredible, and it may actually kind of hint toward the magnitude of the importance of the end state that we're trying to achieve here. That consciousness will go to any length and any depth, any breadth to get to a better end state, if one can be achieved.
Yeah, it's a good point, and really comes down to ever expanding spheres where you have skin in the game, right? So it begins with your own self, or how you understand yourself anyway, and then your family, then your tribe, then your nation state, then your species, right? Yeah, I think that what's fascinating is what we're discussing here is kind of this notion where the original undivided consciousness, again, to use a Bernardo Kastrup kind of description, divided into these alters, right? These disassociations of itself. That the reason why telepathy and precognition and the fact that these others can get into our heads and determine what we do, the reason why all that's possible is because we actually are all part of the same substrate of consciousness, the mind of God, if you will, if you can handle the baggage, or at least put the baggage aside for a while. And that you have these iterations over time where the Godhead basically subdivides into these units of consciousness, and then does this for the sake of experiencing reality all over again in a novel way, which then creates unique experience, which gets, and lessons learned that get contributed back to the totality, right? I think one aspect that I've experienced in some of my altered state of consciousnesses is that even who I am becomes much deeper and broader. And I find myself experiencing reality as a kind of plurality of beings, that I no longer have this hard line between who I am and who these others are, that there's actually this notion of a plurality. And it's very hard to describe because it's hard to, I think, people to even conceive of. But when you experience it, it feels completely normal. That's what's strange about it. And then you come back into this very finite construct of a body mind, and it feels actually very limiting in comparison to that. So much of this is relative to what we're familiar with. But yeah, I think that this is what it really gets down to. And I think the reason why I would even say to people, because some people will say to me, well, how do you know that aliens care about us? Why would they care about us? What makes you assume that? That sounds anthropocentric or something. And what we're saying with this model is that consciousness is fundamental. Human consciousness is derivative of something deeper, something that is common to all consciousnesses across the cosmos, because ultimately those are all, to some degree, relative experiences of individuality, but are ultimately part of this original connected consciousness that ultimately comes down to one consciousness, right? And again, what's fascinating is even Hoffman's equations show this, right? You can take one human being and is a conscious agent, right? Then you can have two people and they are two conscious agents. But even in the math, you can also describe their new interaction, the lessons they learn together, as a new conscious agent, right? In the math, that works. And you can scale that all the way up to all of the sentient beings in the cosmos becoming one ultimate conscious agent, which again sounds a lot like the mind of God, sounds a lot like esoteric spirituality, sounds a lot like the lessons of ancient spiritual traditions, sounds like idealism. But again, what's fascinating is we're seeing evidence pointing in this direction as much from science as we are from, esoteric history.
Mm-hmm. And the role of high strangeness then is to function as a kind of disruptor and a teacher in a way, pointing at this deeper state. That it's the cold water, if you will, to kind of wake you up from a way of being that in some ways is like a cloud. It's a veil that you've kept over yourself to keeping you away from this deeper truth. So in this way, we should celebrate the high strangeness that we encounter. We should look at how it can be incorporated in our experience. We should listen to others' experiences of high strangeness and think about how that impacted their lives as the individual, how it thus impacts our lives in relationship with them, and the new meaning which emerges from that relationship dynamic between our personal story, their story, and the story that emerges between the two. These are the sort of things that begin to happen when you look at the world in this way, in this non-dual way, and you come to find all of these opportunities, as bizarre and strange as they may be, to celebrate conscious expression in all its forms, even the ones that are disturbing and frightening, because you're now situating these things in a totally different paradigm. You're not situating them as adversarial. You're situating them as beneficial to your growth and development, to your expanding awareness of how things really are.
Yeah, and to use that analogy, we understand that toddlers will get feisty and throw tantrums and think that everything belongs to them, and they go through stages where they think everyone should make decisions and act according to what they want, right? Really, at the bottom of it, evil really is more about immaturity of consciousness, right? That if everything ultimately is this undivided substrate of consciousness, then not only am I no different than you ultimately, only relatively are we different, but so too are the abducting aliens who are conducting experiments on people, right? They too are going through that experience of going through many lifetimes and learning, sometimes the hard way, but inevitably learning that we are all connected, and to harm someone else is to harm yourself. So again, I think of the spirit of science where it says that the great thing about reality is that it will do what it does regardless of how you feel about it, right? And so the scientist who really embraces the spirit of science says, listen, if weird things happen that show me that my hypothesis about reality is wrong, I should embrace that, because that's the great thing about reality. It tells me what really is, regardless of what I think about what really is. And so hopefully, eventually, high strangeness will be the next level of data that begins to unravel our current notions of reality, and not only give us new ones, but again, hopefully bring meaning and purpose back into lives, which could hopefully transform human civilization altogether.
All worth celebrating. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation this evening. Thank you for having this with me and exploring the contours of high strangeness together. I know we'll continue to do so in the podcasts ahead. So as we close this episode of Liminal Frames, we thank you for listening and for your comments and shares. It means a lot to us. We do read all of them, and look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you as well. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.